Hi again then guys, and welcome to another installment of Beards and Cars. For those who are unfamiliar with this series, it's every Saturday, podcast style, where we get into discussions. Could be top 10 countdowns, could be predictions for Gran Turismo, could be talking about Forza and Gran Turismo, or YouTube drama, or a wide variety of other things. But for this particular one, I wanted to get into a very abstract discussion, because this is not one of those, oh, check out this evidence or check out these leaks. It's not that kind of discussion. This is a completely pie-in-the-sky, personal preference kind of conversation that we can have in the comments down below, and also, of course, throw in my 2 cents for the video itself. Now, the game in question, or the franchise in question, technically, is Tourist Trophy. And chances are, when you saw this video, you thought one of two things. Either, what in the hell is Tourist Trophy? Or, yes, I love Tourist Trophy, because that seems to be the general consensus of this game. Everyone who knows about it loves it, and everyone who doesn't know about it just doesn't. I've very rarely, if ever, heard any hate for Tourist Trophy, and it's not surprising, because I would argue it's actually still the overall best motorbike racing game ever. And I know that's a very strong statement to make, but for me, having a motorbike game has always had this disadvantage of just being purely focused in on MotoGP more often than not, basically the bike equivalent of an F1 game, which I also have no interest in because it's so boring to me. But that essential problem is that you don't have much to work with. You've got a selection of tracks, very few bikes, and it's purely based around this one particular championship. That's most bike games. Then most of the bikes that tend to be good in games aren't actually in bike games. They're in stuff like Project Gotham or Test Drive Unlimited or The Crew, stuff like that. So bikes don't really get their due deserts, really. They deserve a brilliant game. And for me, Tourist Trophy, I think, is that. And to the point where there was something like, I think, 300 bikes in the first Tourist Trophy game. And it's taken how long for any other bike game to even come close to that? I mean, Ride 1 and 2 were the closest. Now Ride 3, I think, has a similar amount, maybe even more. But look how long it's taken for somebody to actually beat Tourist Trophy in terms of the bike count. And that's a traditional Gran Turismo, or more accurately, a polyphony thing to have. Gran Turismo's always been known for having so many cars, and it's only relatively recently that other franchises even started to catch up. Of course, most notably being Forza. Now, as far as Tourist Trophy 1 goes, it's essentially Gran Turismo 4 with bikes. If you've never played it, that's the idea you should have in mind. Very similar color palette, similar soundtrack, similar menu. Not the same, but very similar, very clearly the same generation. And the graphics, of course, are just as good. It was a PS2 game as well. And just like Gran Turismo 4, the graphics hold up remarkably well. Yet another reason why Gran Turismo 4 is my favourite Gran Turismo game. It was remarkable for its time. You go back and play that game, colossal career mode, 700 plus cars, tons of tuning, tons of tracks, amazing graphics for its time in 2004, and all on an 8 megabyte memory card. Absolutely insane. No updates, no DLC, just a pure, brilliant game that would take in excess of a good probably 4 or 5 months to complete every race in the game. Massive, and that's if you just grind it every day. Perfect game, as far as I'm concerned. Tourist Trophy is that for bikes. Now, it's not as big, of course, as Gran Turismo 4. There's like half as many vehicles. The career mode isn't structured in the same way. If I recall correctly, I don't think you even earn any money in that game. You actually ride the bike in an event to unlock it, which I think is a really cool way of doing things. And again, that ties into stuff that I've talked about on the channel before, where winning vehicles is kind of a thing of the past, and I miss that because it gave you something to work towards. With Tourist Trophy, that was an integral part of the game. Kind of similar to Gran Turismo PSP in that way, where the career mode was completely different to a traditional Gran Turismo title. But for this particular discussion, of course, with that groundwork being laid, what I want to get into is something which I get asked to talk about a lot. And it's something which I want to talk about, and now we finally are. But the reason why I was a little apprehensive is because most of the stuff that I talk about, if not all of it usually, is based on at least some kind of maybe circumstantial or tangential evidence that can point towards it being a possibility, so that my videos are not clickbait. You know that if I say something in the title, unless it's April Fool's, You click on that video, and that's what you're going to get. So for instance, recently with the 6 new Lambos, are they going to come to the game? Maybe, maybe not. Check out that video. Of course, I referenced potential evidence. I didn't say that it was concrete, of course, and I never do in my videos unless I know that it is. And that was what made me apprehensive about this one, because it's not like I can say definitively yes or no. But that's not necessarily a bad thing, because we've had videos like this before where we can get into more of a discussion, and sometimes not knowing for sure actually allows you to have more freedom with the conversation down in the comments. So that's what I wanted to use this video for, to discuss, first of all, do you think we will ever see a Tourist Trophy 2? Secondly, do you want us to have a Tourist Trophy 2? Because those two questions are very different. Because, of course, I would like to see Gran Turismo 2 remastered on the PS4. That doesn't mean it's going to happen. It's not going to happen. I would love to see Gran Turismo 4 re-released. Again, it's not going to happen. But that doesn't mean that you don't want it to. So they are very different questions. So I'd love to hear your thoughts down below, first of all, on do you want it to have a second game? Were you a fan of the first one? And do you think it will? Now, first of all, for me, I think it's pretty clear that, of course, I do want a second one. Now, I think it's interesting as far as timing of when this could potentially be released. And that is that when the first game came out, it was somewhere between Gran Turismo 4 and 5, if I recall correctly. And that meant that it borrowed very heavily from the nearest game, which, of course, was Gran Turismo 4, and that's very clear when you play the game. So if we had a Tourist Trophy 2 within, let's say, the next 2 years, well, that would probably mean that it would be based on very similar aspects to what they are currently doing in GT Sport. Now, that may rub some people the wrong way, because a ton of people are getting very disappointed with GT Sport. The amount of comments here on the channel that say stuff like GT Sport is dead, I'm sick of these updates, they give us what we don't want, focus on new circuits instead of new cars, these recurring comments from multiple members of the community, and although they're not the overwhelming majority, there are a significant amount of them. And certainly, and this is unarguable, there are more people hating on the game than any previous Gran Turismo game, by far. So, if that were to happen, and if they were to make a Tourist Trophy 2, based on GT Sport's layout, like Tourist Trophy did with GT4, what would that look like? Well, for one thing, although that would, as I said, potentially rub some people the wrong way, I actually think that would be a good idea. Because with GT Sport, Polyphony proved one very interesting thing, and that is, for many players of GT Sport and of Gran Turismo overall, you are still willing, I am still willing, we are still willing to buy a game even if it doesn't have anywhere near as many vehicles, because we trust that Polyphony will deliver. And that's the crux of why many people have been disappointed with it, because they don't think that they have delivered. And I agree with some of those sentiments. However, if they were to do that with Tourist Trophy, it would actually be kind of appropriate, because imagine what that bike game would be like. You would have far less bikes, but with far better graphics, updated physics, a more streamlined and probably better career mode than the first game had, because in comparison, Gran Turismo's had massive career modes and has gone smaller, whereas I think Tourist Trophy would probably do the opposite. It had a very basic career mode back then, and it would probably get a bit more substantial now, with very Gran Turismo Sport-esque events. Now, I'm not suggesting that it would necessarily have like the Nations Cup style tie-in or FIA, but then again, who knows? You could actually end up seeing some kind of Gran Turismo, or I should say Polyphony tie-in with like MotoGP stuff. Imagine how cool that would be. I think plenty of players would love to have the opportunity to end up being a motorbike racer in a similar way to how the Nations Cup finalists are with the esports, regardless of whether they ended up in a real motorbike, even if it was just esports. I think a ton of people would love to be in that. And it would be very, very competitive, just like real-world motorbike racing is. Now, is it going to happen? That's the secondary question, because I do think that it should, and I, of course, would love to see it happen. And I actually think, and this may be controversial, that a Gran Turismo Sport-style game, but with bikes instead, would actually be perfect. I think that would make a perfect Tourist Trophy 2. Because for one thing, nobody ever expects bike games to be as big as car games, so very few people would actually be disappointed if you ended up with something the size of GT Sport, but with bikes instead. I think we'd be pretty happy with that, in fact. Especially if you had scapes and livery editor and the community stuff, that would be amazing for a bike game. However, will it happen? Well, it's very hard to say either way because of such a lack of evidence. The only real thing that we have to go on is that Kaz has been asked a number of times at different events, do they have plans to? And he's basically said things to the effect of, we have it in mind, or we've talked about it. So it's nothing concrete at the moment, but it is at least interesting to know that it's an idea. It's there in their mind, because that's better than nothing, let's be honest. If they just said no, then that would be that. And this entire discussion would be pointless. But the fact that they've actually discussed it or even have it on their mind currently, I think is a pretty good sign, because it means that not only are they focusing in on what GT Sport is, doubtless what Gran Turismo 7 will be, but they're also considering these offshoots. Because, for instance, consider Forza. Forza was a perfect racing franchise, and then they produced Forza Horizon, this offshoot that nobody was necessarily asking for. But then, that secondary offshoot franchise has actually ended up arguably being a more popular game than the main motorsport titles. Forza Horizon 3 and Horizon 4 are among the best games that Forza has ever made, and among the most popular and the best reviewed. That's amazing. That very rarely happens with an offshoot game. So imagine if Gran Turismo did the same thing, because let's be honest, that's what Tourist Trophy is. Tourist Trophy is the Horizon of Gran Turismo. It's the offshoot that people didn't know that they wanted, but then once they got it, they realized this is awesome. So if they brought it back again, I actually think, especially with the current climate of people disliking GT Sport more than any other game before in the franchise, and again, I'm not speaking for everyone, but there are definitely people out there, and plenty of them, very vocal ones, I think they would be more ready than ever to potentially try something different, like a bike game. And trust me, if you've never played the first one, even if you're not necessarily the most crazy person about bikes, I think you'd enjoy it a lot, because that first game is really fun. It's similar enough to Gran Turismo to be very nostalgic for those players, but at the same time different enough to deserve being its own thing. And to me, that's a very cool idea. Now, for me personally, the perfect scenario would, of course, be having a crossover, like Gran Turismo HD tried to do. Have bikes and cars in the same game. Not necessarily in the same races, but in the same game with like separate career modes. Imagine, for instance, and this is what I would do if I was Polyphony, and of course I don't know the circumstances surrounding their business, so of course this is all pie in the sky stuff, but if I was the creative director of what that game could be, I would say make something that has the layout of Gran Turismo 5 with the dual career modes, but have one career mode for cars and the other for bikes. That would be my perfect scenario. And of course, I would save stuff like having cars and bikes in the same race for potentially another offshoot of the franchise. For instance, a street racing Gran Turismo game, but with the physics of Gran Turismo. So it wouldn't be an arcade game. It would be something that's as sim-cadey as Gran Turismo is, but on the streets. Imagine how popular that would be. I would personally call it Gran Turismo World. Now, if that were to happen, of course, tons of people would like it, I think, but at the same time, this is just about Tourist Trophy, so that's for another time. Will it happen then? Well, of course we can't say for sure. The whole point of this video is just discussing either way. But if I had to pick yes or no, I would say yes, I think it will happen. However, I think it will probably happen after Gran Turismo 7. Because currently, they are so focused in on the nation sport stuff to the point where even updates aren't getting done as they were before, that clearly that is the focus of what they're doing. And making this entirely different offshoot game would take a lot of time. So maybe they could get that done as well, but I doubt it. Whereas with Gran Turismo 7, doubtless they're already developing that game. We're going to see a lot of crossover from Gran Turismo Sport into that new game. Probably the graphics, the physics, a number of elements like the livery editor and photo mode will be carried over. Of course, the Vision GT cars will probably be as well. So we will see a lot of crossover between the two, but at the same time, I think that the advantage of waiting for Polyphony would be that once they've made a Gran Turismo 7 and have it on the market, the game will be so much bigger than Gran Turismo Sport is, because it arguably has to be, because it's a traditional Gran Turismo title, that will give them the time to take a breather and actually focus on a Tourist Trophy 2, whereas with Gran Turismo Sport, it's such a small game that all eyes are on it, constantly waiting for new stuff, and you can work through career mode so quickly. It's such a small game in comparison to the previous ones that of course people are going to be complaining about not having more, whereas with GT7 you're going to have so much more, hopefully at least, to work with in terms of tracks, career mode, and probably vehicles as well, that it will give them that breathing time. That's what I would argue. Doesn't mean it's going to happen, of course, but that's what I think will probably happen. If we get a Tourist Trophy 2, I believe it will be after Gran Turismo 7. Maybe within a year after it, for instance, or around a year after it. So, those are my thoughts. Of course, I'd love to hear yours down below. If you haven't played Tourist Trophy, try to, if you get the chance. It's well worth it. Even if you don't end up liking it as much as Gran Turismo, it's still worth a look, just like Horizon is with Forza. But that's it for my thoughts. Of course, I'll see you guys next time, and for now, as always, thanks for watching.